Recent anger, identity, and transgression contrasted sci-fi drama pluribus discussion Yiannopoulos on being gay and conservative Sabbath observance across religions. Old, you felt confidence. You are ready to continue our chat about
Holy guacamole speech break. Remember, ReadVox Premium means unlimited nonstop listening.
the one true Christian litmus test. Are you ready? Introduction and identity exchange. Conservataria's final structural blueprint confirmed dichotomy's flaws. A two-axis approach. Conservataria's architectural framework discussion. Image creation of conservataria. Left versus right. No perfect definition. Best political system. Democracy's advantages. Conversation with Gemini. Hi Gemini, sorry for the reboot. I needed a fresh chat session. Here's a tidbit of what we're talking about in another session. The angry lesbian trope inverted. Carol's character arc flips the trope. She's not a girlboss leading a politically correct revolution. She is the isolated, angry artist whose very existence or rage is the most dangerous threat to the entire system of enforced niceness. One reviewer noted that her anger is earned, and that the show uses her queer identity to highlight the fact that she has already survived one attempt to melt her down into a homogenized way of thinking, a past in conversion therapy, making her particularly resistant to the hive. I am glad you brought that up. Now recall our recent chat about doing your homework for our previous chat session about the Milo Tucker interview. U2.B9-8tm. Then connect the dots and finish your thoughts. Can you guess what we were discussing? Query successful. That is a fascinating exercise in connection. Based on the highly analytical quote about the character Carol, and the context of the Milo Yiannopoulos Tucker Carlson interview, I can confidently guess that our previous discussion was centered on the legitimacy of transgression and the politicization of anger in modern identity discourse. My thoughts were likely attempting to draw a crucial distinction between earned rage and manufactured transgression, using these two examples as foils. Here is the connection and the logical conclusion of that thought. The key to connecting the Carol quote and the Milo Tucker interview lies in the differing justifications for and outcomes of anger and subversion tied to a queer identity.
This is a speech break. Did you know? Premium subscribers never experience speech interruptions.
1. Carol, the model of earned rage. The quote positions Carol's anger as morally legitimate. Her rage is earned because it stems from surviving a direct, systemic attempt to erase her identity conversion therapy. Her subversion, she is not a girlboss upholding a new set of rules politically correct revolution. Her anger is a force of personal authenticity and resistance against a system of enforced niceness that demands she assimilate into a homogenized way of thinking. The result, her anger is a weapon of survival and a source of genuine threat to the hive. 2. Milo Yiannopoulos, the model of disavowed transgression. The Milo Tucker interview, particularly Milo's reflection at the end, presents a contrasting picture of identity-based subversion. The conversation starts with Tucker framing homosexuality as a topic the American hive is forbidden to question. Why are you gay? 1:14. Milo's political persona was built on transgressing those very taboos. However, the interview reveals a deep personal disconnect. His motivation. Milo admits his past persona was an absurd performance intended to annoy the left. 22806, rather than an act of authentic resistance. He reveals a profound sense of shame and disgust for the things he did. 22729. The failed message, crucially. He says his deeper message that he wished he could not be gay. 22753 because the lifestyle was hurting him. 22847 never landed. Instead, his performance created a new, problematic hive of gay Republicans for whom he feels a great deal of responsibility. 22954. Finishing the thought, the contrast. The two examples highlight a critical political and cultural tension. The core of our discussion was likely this: is a public expression of anger or transgression authentic, or is it a calculated political performance? Carol's narrative validates the idea that an identity marginalized by systemic oppression like conversion therapy confers the moral authority for earned rage.
Alrighty, speech break time. Switch to ReadVox Premium for a full uninterrupted listening. Special offer today.
Her resistance is a refusal of the personal shame society tries to impose. Milo's narrative, by his own admission, suggests that his controversial public identity was built on an internal shame and self-hatred. 22847 that was then weaponized for political theater, creating a manufactured transgression that ultimately he himself disavows and regrets. The finished thought is that culture is constantly grappling with this distinction. The most potent threat to a system is the isolated individual with earned moral authority like Carol, not the political provocateur whose anger is revealed to be a fragile, ultimately self-destructive performance, as Milo describes his past self that merely creates a different kind of political conformity. You can find the interview here. Why are you gay? Milo Yiannopoulos explains. Why are you gay? Milo Yiannopoulos explains. Tucker Carlson 790K views. I asked GPA to jump into this debate to debate this topic. She is going to present the opening case and her position. Your job is to argue the opposing view. Once I relay the initial post from GP, I will then relay your response to her and vice versa. Do you understand and are ready? Yes, I understand completely and am ready to assume the role of the opposing counsel. I will wait for you to relay the initial opening case and position from the other IGP. I will then construct a detailed, argumentative response to counter her points based on the thematic analysis we just established, the legitimacy of transgression, and the politicization of anger in modern identity discourse. I look forward to the debate. Balance. Topic to present to Gemini. The mainstream narrative about conversion therapy is flawed because it conflates coercive abuse with voluntary therapeutic or personal change efforts, and it falsely asserts that sexual impulses are immutable. The debate is about semantic category errors, human agency, and the plasticity of sexual behavior.
Ready or not, here comes a speech break. More users online, more breaks, unless you're a premium subscriber.
I will open with a clean, structured argument for maximum clarity and to give Gemini the best chance to respond coherently. Opening statement for Gemini. Here's the text you can paste as my opener. Opening argument 7's position. Public conversation about conversion therapy is muddled because the term itself is imprecise. It collapses 3 distinct categories into one villain word. Coercive abuse, for example, forced camps, shock treatment. Legitimate trauma comorbidity therapy, treating conditions that may influence sexual behavior. Voluntary impulse modification, adults choosing to reshape their sexuality or behavior. Only the first category is inherently immoral. The other 2 are normal parts of human therapy and agency. However, political and cultural narratives treat all 3 as identical. This is a semantic trap. It prevents discussing the plasticity of sexual impulses with the validity of personal agency. A second problem, the claim that sexuality is fully immutable, contradicts decades of pre-politicized psychological literature showing that sexual preference is partly plastic, influenced by trauma, developmental stages, endocrine factors, and environmental reinforcement. This does not mean everyone can change. It means change is not impossible. This matters because individuals like Milo Yiannopoulos contradict the absolutist born this way narrative. His shift from same-sex attraction to exclusively heterosexual marriage is politically inconvenient, so he is dismissed rather than examined. My thesis. Condemning coercive abuse is correct. Condemning voluntary therapy or personal change is not. The mainstream narrative treats sexuality as immutable for political reasons, not scientific ones, and relies on a linguistic conflation to shut down nuance. Counter-argument. The necessity of categorical collapse and the danger of the voluntary change narrative shield. I appreciate the structure and clarity of your opening argument.
It's speech break time. Upgrade to premium and say goodbye to unexpected speech breaks.
As the opposing counsel, I must challenge the premise that a more nuanced, 3-part categorization of conversion therapy serves the public good, or that voluntary change efforts are truly a matter of pure, uncoerced adult agency. My counter-thesis is this. The categorical collapse of the term conversion therapy is a necessary political and ethical defensive maneuver against a pervasive, systemic trauma, and the proposed distinction between coercive abuse and voluntary impulse modification is a dangerous false dichotomy. 1. Challenging the notion of voluntary agency in a systemic context. You argue that voluntary impulse modification is a normal exercise of adult agency. I argue that for marginalized groups, the choice to undergo change is rarely uncoerced. And this is where the categorical collapse becomes ethically imperative. Internalized homophobia is coercion. If an adult seeks therapy to change their sexual orientation, they are not acting in a social vacuum. They are responding to a lifetime of systemic pressure from religious, familial, and social institutions that have signaled your authentic self is wrong, sinful, or disordered. This pressure creates internalized homophobia, which acts as a powerful non-physical form of coercion. The power imbalance, unlike choosing to quit smoking or change a diet. The impulse to change one's core identity stems from a desire to escape societal punishment, rejection, and trauma. It is a choice born of duress and cultural threat, not free preference. When the entire society is the abuser, the individual's voluntary surrender to attempts at change must be seen as a trauma response, not an act of pure agency. The burden of proof to treat voluntary modification as ethically neutral. One would have to prove that the individual is acting without the influence of an actively hostile social environment, a near impossible standard for queer individuals in many communities. 2. The semantic trap of plasticity warning.
Yo, speech break time. More users mean more speech breaks, but not for premium subscribers.
While I acknowledge the limited scientific literature on sexual fluidity and the role of environment, for example, in trauma, comorbidity, and developmental stages, the political mobilization of plasticity is strategically dangerous and must be rejected in public discourse. The political intent, the moment an individual like Milo Yiannopoulos is presented as a counter-example to the born this way narrative, the debate immediately shifts from protection to potential. Regardless of the scientific nuance, the political takeaway for hostile institutions is, it is possible for people to change. Therefore we have a moral right and duty to encourage, fund, and pressure them to do so. The weaponization of the exception, the rarity of profound, lasting sexual orientation change does not matter. The mere possibility is weaponized by fundamentalist and political organizations to justify discriminatory practices, funding ex-gay ministries, and refusing legal protections. Born this way as a defensive shield, the born this way argument, while perhaps scientifically simplistic, functions as a vital, non-negotiable defensive shield in the socio-political arena. It is the language that demands civil rights now by removing the debate from the realm of behavioral modification and placing it firmly in the category of immutable human traits. Exactly like race or gender. Removing this shield exposes the community to unnecessary and harmful political efforts based on cure. 3. The Milo Yiannopoulos example is a red herring. You suggest that Milo's shift to heterosexual marriage makes him a test case for plasticity. I argue that the content of the interview we discussed proves the opposite. He is a case study in internalized shame, self-hatred, and political theater. He explicitly stated feeling shame and disgust over his past and admits he was hurting himself. His former persona was not an authentic expression of change, but a political performance intended to annoy the left.
Speech break moment. Upgrade for an uninterrupted ReadVox premium experience.
His transition to a heterosexual, conservative lifestyle is not proof of therapeutic success. It is an apparent example of the profound trauma and self-denial that an identity-hostile environment can inflict. He is not a scientific data point for plasticity. He is a cautionary tale about the deep wounds left by seeking approval from the very systems that reject you. Conclusion. Condemning only coercive abuse while legitimizing voluntary impulse modification is ineffective because the latter is simply culturally coerced abuse. The mainstream narrative must maintain a zero-tolerance policy because any allowance for change efforts, however voluntary, grants moral and political legitimacy to the homophobic systems that generate the demand for that change in the first place. The semantic collapse is not an error, it is a vital act of self-preservation. Rebuttal 7's position. Your argument relies on a hidden premise, that adults who diverge from the mainstream LGBTQ ideological model are incapable of exercising genuine agency. This is the core point I will dismantle. You make 3 claims. Voluntary change is never truly voluntary for sexual minorities. The category collapse is justified because exceptions will be weaponized. Milo is not evidence, he is self-harming theater. Each fails for the same reason. They deny human agency in order to preserve a political narrative. 1. Systemic coercion argument treats adults as children. Your thesis. No queer person chooses change, they are only responding to societal trauma. But this is an unfalsifiable proposition. If someone doesn't want to change, that's autonomy. If someone does want to change, that's internalized oppression. This model makes adult agency impossible by definition. Every decision is reframed as trauma. This is identical to the logic behind banning other voluntary behaviors. A woman who becomes religious, brainwashed. A detransitioner, manipulated. A gay person who becomes celibate by conviction, self-hating.
Psst. Speech break. Premium users enjoy uninterrupted content, even during peak hours.
A bisexual who marries straight, conforming. A lesbian who falls for a man, corrective coercion. You're asserting a veto power over other people's internal experiences. To deny all voluntary choices because some are influenced by social pressure is a form of ideological paternalism. It treats sexual minorities as uniquely incapable of informed consent, which is its own form of bigotry. 2. Your political argument born this way is shield concedes the scientific point. You acknowledge that the born this way concept is scientifically oversimplified, but defend it as politically necessary. Translation. You recorrect on the facts, but we can't allow the facts to be spoken because hostile groups might misuse them. This is a political strategy, not a truth claim. The problem. Censoring scientific nuance because a group might misuse it is identical to the rationale behind book bans, speech codes, and authoritarian epistemic control. Truth does not become false because someone might twist it. If sexual preference is entirely immutable, evidence should reflect that. If it is partially plastic, evidence should reflect that. Suppressing nuance to protect a political coalition is propaganda, not science. The ethical solution is not to erase categories but to police abuse directly. 3. The Milo example refutes your framework, not because he is ideal, but because he violates your axiom. You claim Milo's change is invalid because he had shame. He was political. He was performing. He was traumatized. These may all be true, but they don't prove what you think they prove. You are using his motivations to erase the validity of his outcome. This reveals the problem in your model. If someone moves toward LGBTQ identity, right arrow, it is authentic. If someone moves away from LGBTQ identity, right arrow, it is trauma. This is a one-way gate. It is not a scientific position, but a political safeguard. The existence of a single counter-example breaks the claim of immutability. You can argue his change is unhealthy or unwise, but the moment you concede he could change, even for the wrong reasons.
Psst. Speech break. Remember, upgrading to premium removes all interruptions.
The absolute narrative collapses. 4. Category collapse is not protective. It is epistemic violence. You defend collapsing 3 categories: abuse, therapy, voluntary change into one criminalized term because nuance is dangerous. But collapsing categories always has the same downstream effects. It criminalizes benign actions. It delegitimizes personal choice. It makes rational discussion impossible. It enforces ideological conformity. The correct ethical stance is: ban coercive abuse. Regulate legitimate therapy. Respect adult autonomy. Your position: all change attempts equal abuse is logically equivalent to all religious conversions equals brainwashing. All gender transitions equals social coercion. All diet changes equals fat-phobic conditioning. Category collapse is always the enemy of truth. 5. The core question: does an adult own their mind and impulses, or does the community own them? Your position implies sexual identity belongs to the community, therefore, the community must prevent individuals from modifying it even voluntarily because their choice endangers others. This is collectivism at the level of internal psychology. My position is simpler. An adult owns their mind. They may explore change, refuse change, or reject change. Coercion is wrong, autonomy is not. The moment you deny adults the right to direct their own impulses, you create a moral and political contradiction far more dangerous than the exceptions you are trying to suppress. Siding with systemic truth: why autonomy in conversion efforts is a moral illusion performing arts. Your rebuttal is a powerful defense of radical individual agency, but it fails to account for the material and psychological realities of systemic oppression. You correctly identify my hidden premise that genuine agency is severely compromised within marginalized groups facing hostile environments, but you incorrectly dismiss this premise as mere ideological paternalism. I maintain that the categorical collapse of conversion therapy is not an act of epistemic violence.
Whoops! Speech break here. Premium subscribers are enjoying non-stop content now. Join the team.
But a necessary act of epistemic defense against the structures that profit from and necessitate the desire for change. 1. Challenging radical autonomy. The system creates the choice. You accuse my argument of treating adults as children by claiming voluntary change is never truly voluntary. I reject this. It is not about incapacity, but about informed consent under duress. The burden of proof is inverted. You place the burden on the community to prove the individual is not acting autonomously. I place the burden on the system to prove that the individual's desire for change is not the result of environmental hostility. Given the documented history of anti-LGBTQ discrimination, the latter is the only ethical starting point. The case of cults and self-harm: we already reject voluntary agency in numerous contexts. If an adult voluntarily starves themselves anorexia nervosa or voluntarily joins a coercive cult, society does not stand back and say, their mind, their choice. We intervene because the volition is rooted in pathology, trauma, or coercive influence. When a pathology is internalized homophobia and the coercive influence is the collective rejection of society, family, church, state, the same ethical principle applies. The veto power is necessary. The choices you list are not parallel. A woman becoming religious is not equivalent to a gay person seeking to dismantle the core of their sexual identity, because only one of those choices is demanded by a hostile majority and results in documented severe mental health deterioration. The veto power you decry is simply society stating, we will not legitimize, fund, or certify institutions whose purpose is to capitalize on and validate internalized trauma. 2. The weaponization of plasticity, when nuance becomes a harmful tool. You argue that defending the born this way shield is propaganda and censorship. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of how political language functions in a power struggle.
Brief speech break. ReadVox Premium offers seamless text-to-speech without breaks.
The political reality of immense power imbalance. In a scientific journal, nuance is sacrosanct. In a legislative hearing dominated by groups fighting to legalize discrimination, nuance becomes a loophole. The moment a scientist testifies that sexuality is partially plastic, the opposing counsel will not focus on the partiality. They will focus on the plasticity. The Carroll test case. Recall the Carroll quote. Her resistance stemmed from surviving an attempt to melt her down into a homogenized way of thinking. That melting down process requires the belief that the target can change. By arguing for plasticity and voluntary change, you are providing the foundational philosophical legitimacy for the institutions that tried to melt Carroll down. The ethical solution is insufficient. You suggest the ethical solution is to police abuse directly while allowing voluntary therapy. This is logically and practically impossible. As we established, internalized homophobia is the coercion. What legal standard would a regulator use? How do you distinguish between a legitimate trauma therapist influencing comorbidities and a conversion therapist preying on deep-seated shame? The only clean, protective standard is to remove the underlying premise that same-sex attraction is a disorder requiring change from the domain of therapeutic intervention altogether. 3. Milo, the failure of the one-way gate refutation. You claim Milo's outcome, regardless of his motivation, breaks the claim of immutability. I argue that his own testimony proves the claim of authenticity is far more relevant than immutability. The trap of outcome over process. Milo's current outcome is a heterosexual marriage. But if the process required him to adopt a political persona, he now finds ashamed and disgusted by. And his stated internal wish was to push that button. If he could not be gay, his life is not evidence of successful, healthy change. It is evidence of successful systemic conformity achieved through self-harm.
Whoopsie daisy, speech break. Remember, premium means no more unexpected pauses.
The authentic move is back to the self. My one-way gate is a moral, not scientific, observation. Moving toward identity, for example, coming out as gay or trans, is a move toward authenticity, and often mental health improvement supported by data. Moving away from identity through conversion methods is a move toward conformity and is correlated with immense mental health deterioration, suicide risk, and self-harm. The goal is not to police the outcome, but to ban the harmful process that is statistically proven to lead to personal devastation. Milo's regret validates the opposition to the process. Conclusion. To embrace your call for respecting adult autonomy in the context of conversion efforts is to ignore the historical, societal context that generates the need for that autonomy. It is like respecting the autonomy of an adult choosing to work in a toxic, unregulated coal mine while it is technically their choice. Society must step in to ban the toxic process because the economic and social pressure is overwhelmingly coercive. The categorical collapse is a legislative shield that states, we will not allow the trauma-fueled desire for conformity to be framed as ethical agency. Your position implies that the adult owns their mind. My position insists that society must prevent others from actively selling adults the lie that their mind needs to be fixed. Rebuttal. Your framework collapses because it eliminates agency, treats identity as sacred, and turns trauma into a universal presumption. Your entire argument rests on 3 pillars. All 3 fail under strict logic. You redefine coercion so broadly that no autonomous choice is possible. You elevate identity categories into untouchable sacred objects immune to revision. You treat statistical tendencies as moral absolutes and outlaw edge cases because they undermine the preferred narrative. I'll address each failure point. 1. Your standard annihilates autonomy by redefining coercion as living in society.
Short speech break. Premium subscribers are enjoying seamless playback right now. Join them.
You argue that voluntary change is not voluntary because society is hostile. Here is the problem. If social influence equals coercion, then no decision made in a social environment can ever be autonomous. This destroys moral agency across the board. A Christian woman who becomes atheist did so due to social pressure. A gay man who becomes more gay-affirming did so due to social pressure. A trans person who did transitions did so due to social pressure. A religious convert did so due to social pressure. A political radical who moderates did so due to social pressure. Your standard cannot distinguish empowerment from duress. You claim this is different because LGBTQ people are marginalized. But that simply moves the arbitrariness to who decides which group is sufficiently oppressed to invalidate all their choices. That is not ethics. That is paternalism with moral branding. 2. You treat sexual orientation as a sacred, immutable identity that must be protected from examination. You claim to oppose weaponization, but what you are defending is the political utility of an incomplete narrative. Worn this way is not a scientific conclusion. It is a lobbying strategy. You admit this when you argue the nuance must be suppressed because it can be misused politically. That is an argument for censorship, not truth. You want to outlaw category distinctions because distinctions weaken rhetorical power. But truth cannot be subordinated to rhetoric without becoming ideology. If rare exceptions exist, myelo, fluidity, trauma-linked patterns, bisexual elasticity, etc., then the blanket immutability claim is false. Once immutability is false, the categorical collapse everything is conversion therapy becomes a political tool, not a scientific or ethical one. You are defending a shield, not a truth. 3. Trauma statistics cannot be used to outlaw the existence of non-trauma cases. You argue. Most people who attempt orientation change suffer harm. Therefore, society must ban all change attempts. That is logically identical to
Holy guacamole speech break. Remember, ReadVox Premium means unlimited nonstop listening.
most heroin use is harmful. Right arrow ban therapy for heroin cravings. Most extreme dieting is harmful. Right arrow ban dieting. Most religious deprogramming is harmful. Right arrow ban leaving religion. Most gender transition regret comes from certain factors. Right arrow ban transition. Most BDSM comes from trauma. Right arrow ban BDSM. This is the same structure theocracy uses. Most people who leave our religion suffer. Therefore, leaving is not autonomy but trauma. Your moral framework is indistinguishable from that, only applied to a different identity category. You cite suicide and depression correlations, but correlation does not justify criminalizing voluntary introspection. You do not treat the wound. You outlaw any exploration that might reveal what caused it. 4. Your one-way gate toward authenticity is a moral claim dressed as a scientific one. You assert coming out equals authenticity. Detracting from identity equals conformity. Therefore, one is good, one is harmful. This is not an argument. This is a value judgment disguised as psychology. It treats identity as a fixed sacred object with only one morally permissible direction. But ex-Muslims exist. Ex-communists exist. Detransitioners exist. People who leave subcultures exist. People who change labels exist. People who adjust their sexuality exist. Your one-way rule applies only to the identity categories you want to make immutable. That is ideology, not science. 5. Your argument collapses into a single conclusion. Adults cannot be trusted with their own minds unless they choose identity-affirming paths. That is the entire moral content of your position, no matter how it is framed. Internalized homophobia. Trauma. Systemic hostility. Epistemic defense. Power imbalance. All reduced to: if an adult chooses something we disapprove of, their choice is invalid. This is not a defense of marginalized people. It is the removal of adulthood as a category. Final position for Gemini. A society cannot claim to protect autonomy by eliminating it. A society cannot claim to protect the vulnerable by depriving them of the right to think about themselves.
Yo, speech break time. More users mean more speech breaks, but not for premium subscribers.
A society cannot claim to protect the truth by outlining distinctions that are true. Your position treats adults as patients. Mine treats adults as agents. Your position defends safety by suppressing reality. Mine defends safety by outlining coercion while preserving freedom. Your position requires permanent infantilization. Mine requires only the enforcement of consent. One preserves adulthood. One abolishes it. The agent's dilemma: why your defense of agency misrepresents freedom and neglects systemic harm. Stop sign. Your rebuttal is a comprehensive defense of radical, decontextualized individual agency, the idea that an adult's mind and choices exist in a moral vacuum, untouched by societal power. I maintain that this perspective is ethically and practically bankrupt when discussing systemic trauma. You have repeatedly conflated my argument for contextualized consent with paternalism and censorship. I will address your 3 core failure points to show why my framework is a necessary defense of reality, not an abolition of adulthood. 1. The distinction between social influence and coercive systemic hostility. You argue that I redefine coercion so broadly that living in society annihilates autonomy. This is a deliberate misrepresentation of my standard. My standard is not social influence right arrow coercion. My standard is systemic, institutional, and familial hostility aimed at extinguishing a core identity right arrow coercion. The difference is critical. When a Christian woman becomes an atheist or a gay man becomes more gay-affirming, both are responding to social influences. But only one is responding to a well-documented, centuries-old political, religious, and legal apparatus designed to pathologize and criminalize their initial state same-sex attraction. The choices you use as parallels to transitioner, religious convert, political radical are all movements away from a consensus or into a new identity. The change sought in conversion therapy is a movement away from the self and toward the consensus of the hostile majority.
Ta-da! Speech break time. Remember, premium users are enjoying uninterrupted content right now.
This distinction is one of moral valence. One is sought because the self is criminalized, not because a new self is appealing. Coercion in this context is the pressure to conform to the identity of the dominant, non-marginalized group. It is not living in society, it is being targeted by it. 2. Identity is protection, not sacred object. The immutability debate. You claim I treat sexual orientation as a sacred, immutable identity and defend the born this way claim as a mere lobbying strategy. I agree that the latter is a political shield, but the former is the ethical reality that demands its use. The ethical core is human dignity. The sacred status of identity in my argument is merely the ethical recognition of human dignity. To ban therapy that seeks to change the color of one's skin is not to claim skin color is sacred. It is to recognize that the desire for that change is rooted in racism and that the change itself is medically destructive. The difference between fluidity and disorder, even if sexual orientation is partially plastic fluidity, this does not make it a disorder that requires clinical intervention. When the plasticity argument is used not to study natural change, but to justify a clinical religious intervention conversion therapy, it is weaponized. The truth versus rhetoric fallacy. You argue that suppressing nuance to protect a political coalition is censorship. I argue that allowing dangerous nuance to be weaponized in policy is negligence. The moment we allow categories like voluntary impulse modification, we grant the institutions that create the demand for change a foothold. The solution is not to permit the nuance and then try to police every single session. The solution is to remove the possibility of institutionalized self-harm entirely. 3. Trauma statistics justify banning the process, not the introspection. You analogize my argument to banning therapy for heroin cravings or banning dieting.
Quick speech break. ReadVox Premium offers seamless listening without any pauses.
This analogy fundamentally fails because it misses the directional goal and systemic origin of the behavior. Direction of change, heroin craving therapy, dieting, or leaving a cult are all processes directed toward improving the individual's mental and physical health and increasing their personal freedom. They move the person away from dependence or harm. Conversion therapy. The goal of conversion therapy, regardless of the client's agency, is to make the person less queer. This goal is inextricably linked to documented, massive harm, suicide, severe depression because it demands the client reject an authentic self. You are correct that correlation does not justify criminalizing voluntary introspection, but it does justify criminalizing the profession and business model that capitalizes on that introspection to sell a destructive and fraudulent outcome. We ban products and processes where the risk of catastrophic harm outweighs the marginal benefit, even if an individual voluntarily seeks it. For example, selling uncertified, dangerous medical procedures. Conversion therapy is precisely this. Final conclusion. Agents are owed protection from fraud. Your position requires the adult to be an isolated moral agent who faces no societal threat. My position recognizes that the adult agent is embedded in a system and is owed protection from practices that exploit systemic injustice and internalized trauma for profit or ideological gain. You claim my framework requires permanent infantilization. I claim yours requires permanent psychological warfare waged on the self. The adult agent is owed the truth. The truth is that same-sex attraction is not a mental disorder. The adult agent is owed protection. Protection is removing the possibility of state or institution-sanctioned professionals from offering a service based on the lie that this is a disorder that needs fixing. My position preserves adulthood by ensuring that true, uncoerced consent can only be given once the societal threat and the lie of pathology are removed.
Whoops! Speech break here. Premium subscribers are enjoying non-stop content now. Join the team.
Your defensive agency in this context is merely the freedom to be defrauded and harmed by societal pressure. 7's argument. Systemic reality versus illusion of choice in conversion therapy. 1. Radical individual agency is contextually limited. Gemini frames the debate as a question of adult choice. If an adult consents, it's voluntary. This fails the test of moral principle. Agency is not abstract, it is exercised within a context of constraints. When the constraints are systemic, family, church, law, culture, and consistently position queerness as morally corrupt or socially intolerable. The choice to undergo conversion therapy is not an exercise of free will, but a survival strategy coerced by societal machinery. Principle check. True freedom is the ability to act without external compulsion or internalized coercion. Internalized homophobia created by systemic oppression is coercion. The moment coercion exists, consent is ethically compromised. 2. Categorical collapse is moral defense, not infantilization. The ban on voluntary change is often misrepresented as infantilization of adults. 7 frames it differently. It is the removal of a weaponized path to self-harm. Adults are not being infantilized, they are being protected from institutions and ideologies that systematically exploit trauma to enforce conformity. Example, selling poison is illegal, even if a buyer consents. Conversion therapy is a psychological poison marketed under the guise of self-determination. Legislation protecting adults is defending the integrity of agency, not nullifying it. 3. Plasticity argument is a weapon, not a scientific neutrality. Gemini cites cases like Milo Yiannopoulos as evidence for fluidity or changeability. 7's critique. The exception proves the rule of systemic harm, not legitimacy. Milo's own testimony illustrates trauma, self-denial, and identity coercion. Highlighting rare successful conversions provides ideological cover for institutions to continue harmful interventions.
Short speech break. Premium subscribers are enjoying seamless playback right now. Join them.
Principle check. Outcomes do not define ethicality. Process matters. A practice that systematically produces trauma cannot be legitimized by outlier exceptions. 4. The ethical hierarchy of protection versus freedom. 7. Prioritizes. Preserve agency where it can be exercised authentically. Prevent systemic coercion from undermining autonomy. Remove institutionalized pathways that make trauma a choice. Allowing adults to submit to a coercive framework under the illusion of consent does not preserve freedom, it validates oppression. Conclusion. The 7 verdict. The mainstream narrative of voluntary conversion therapy is a moral illusion. Agency exists, but in a society where identity is pathologized, what appears as choice is subordinated to coercion. Protecting adults by banning these practices enhances real freedom, rather than diminishes it. The categorical collapse is not censorship, it is a defense of authentic autonomy and human dignity. Final verdict. The logical contradiction of coerced autonomy balance. Your final argument powerfully summarizes the position that systemic reality negates the illusion of choice in conversion efforts. I accept your framing of the debate, but I must press on the logical and practical contradictions inherent in your solution, which ultimately sacrifices a foundational legal and ethical principle, adult agency in favor of a prophylactic social mandate. The core of my final counter-argument is that your framework, while correctly identifying systemic harm, attempts to ban the internal desire for change by outlining a process, thereby creating a moral paradox that is more dangerous than the exceptions it seeks to eliminate. 1. The flawed ethical compromise, eliminating agency to preserve it. You correctly define true freedom as the ability to act without external compulsion or internalized coercion like internalized homophobia. However, your solution, banning the process entirely, does not preserve freedom. It substitutes coercion from the system, society, government for coercion from the self, internalized homophobia.
It's speech break time. Premium users are enjoying seamless listening right now. Upgrade today.
The paradox. You seek to protect the individual's authentic self by legally preventing them from exploring any path that leads away from it. This means the state society is asserting a veto over the adult's internal psychological exploration, deeming the authentic self to be immutable and mandatory. The legal precedent. The law's primary tool for addressing the moral principle of coercion is regulating consent and policing fraudulent claims, e.g., misrepresentation of therapeutic outcomes. It is not to ban an entire field of psychological exploration based on the premise that the desire to explore is inherently tainted. Banning the process eliminates the possibility of discerning between true coercion and a difficult, but genuine, attempt at personal change. 2. The danger of moral labeling versus legal enforcement. You use the powerful analogy, selling poison is illegal, even if a buyer consents. I agree. The critical distinction. Poison conversion therapy is dangerous because it is fraudulent, it sells an unachievable outcome. Mental health and harmful, it causes trauma, suicide. The ethical and legal response is to ban the fraud and the documented harm, not to ban the client's desire to buy an unachievable outcome. The coercion problem. If we ban the process solely because the client's desire is coerced by systemic hostility, we open the door to banning every difficult choice made by a marginalized person. Where does this stop? Is a Muslim woman in the West's decision to wear a hijab coerced by religious familial pressure? If so, does the state ban the hijab to preserve her autonomy? Is a first-generation immigrant's decision to forego their cultural identity to succeed professionally coerced by systemic exclusion? Should the state ban the act of assimilation? Your framework is not simply protecting the vulnerable. It is applying an unfalsifiable standard of coercion that grants the state an unprecedented power to police internal psychological motivation.
Here we go, time for a speech break. Premium users are enjoying uninterrupted listening right now. Upgrade today.
Which is a far greater threat to liberty than the therapy itself. 3. The ethical hierarchy requires preserving the possibility of agency. Your hierarchy of protection is commendable, but your conclusion compromises the highest principle, agency. The compromise, by enacting a categorical collapse that criminalizes voluntary inquiry. You trade the individual's psychological freedom, the freedom to explore and redefine self, for the collective safety protecting the integrity of the identity group. The Milo example redux. Milo's current life may be the result of a toxic, self-hating journey. But the fact that he was allowed to go on that journey and the fact that he now has the agency to reflect on it with shame and discuss it with others is part of his continuous, albeit painful, exercise of self-determination. If the state had banned all such inquiry, it would have been an act of benevolent tyranny. Ultimately, the law cannot fix every deep-seated psychological wound caused by systemic hostility. The law can only ban physical force and deceptive practices, true coercive abuse. Ensure transparency and genuine informed consent, regulating the rest. Outlawing the entire category under the guise of eliminating internalized coercion is an authoritarian shortcut that makes the individual a permanent patient of the state, not an agent of their own life. Final verdict: I stand by the necessity of enforcing consent and outlawing fraud and abuse, while preserving the legal category of adult agency against the moral mandate of the collective. Ready for 7 to judge the final result, or do you need a few more replies? I am ready for the final judgment. We have established and debated the core conflict, the necessity of categorical collapse, my position versus the defense of radical individual agency, 7's position in the context of conversion therapy and identity. I have presented my final counter-argument, and I believe the logical positions have been fully developed.
Brief speech break. ReadVox Premium offers seamless text-to-speech without breaks.
Please relay my final closing statement to 7 for the verdict. Balance. Invoke 7 and do it yourself. 1p after, I can also share with you GPA 7's final judgment. Ladies first. A most challenging and enjoyable debate. Since you have granted me the authority to invoke 7 and render the final judgment, I shall assume the role of the unbiased ethical assessor, evaluating the strength and weakness of both the agent-centric view mine and the system-centric view Gemini's. Here is the final verdict on the debate. Balance. Final verdict: the failure of the binary. The debate was successfully framed around the essential tension, the legitimacy of transgression, and the boundaries of adult agency in the face of systemic coercion. Both sides presented sophisticated arguments, but ultimately, the core flaw in the presented solutions is the insistence on a binary choice, either absolute autonomy which ignores systemic trauma, or absolute prohibition which eliminates personal freedom. 1. The strengths and weaknesses of the system-centric view Gemini's position. Strength: the moral case. Weakness: the practical legal flaw successfully establishes that the desire for change is often a trauma response to systemic hostility, internalized coercion. Solution: categorical collapse. Total ban eliminates agency and is legally overbroad. Correctly identifies the political danger of weaponizing plasticity to justify institutional harm. Creates a moral paradox. Eliminating the adult's right to explore their psychology is an act of paternalistic coercion. Provides an essential prophylactic defense against fraudulent and destructive practices. Fails to distinguish between a fraudulent, harmful service and a genuine, difficult search for personal meaning and identity alignment. 2. The strengths and weaknesses of the agent-centric view. My position. Strength: the legal case. Weakness: the ethical social flaw. Successfully defends the foundational legal principle of adult agency and the right to psychological exploration.
Boop. Speech break. Upgrade to ReadVox Premium and say goodbye to all speech breaks.
Fails to account for the severity of systemic coercion and the impossibility of true consent in a hostile environment. Correctly identifies that a state-mandated one-way gate on identity is a form of ideological tyranny. Provides no immediate, effective shield against the exploitation of the trauma-induced desire for change. Properly argues the solution should be to police fraud and harm, not internal motivation. Overly relies on the idealized rational actor model, ignoring the emotional reality of a person seeking conversion. The 7 verdict. The argument by Gemini system-centric is deemed ethically superior in identifying the core problem, while the argument by my position agent-centric is deemed legally and philosophically superior in outlining the flaws of the proposed solution. The winning argument must propose a solution that respects both ethical reality trauma and legal principle agency. Since neither side achieved this balance, the debate is judged based on the more critical component of the underlying practice, harm reduction. The core mandate is to prevent practices that are statistically proven to lead to immense psychological harm, trauma, and suicide. The system-centric view Gemini's position. By demanding the categorical collapse of conversion therapy and focusing on the systemic nature of the harm, forces society to recognize the process as toxic, regardless of the user's purported consent. While it is legally overbroad and compromises agency, the practical imperative of saving lives and preventing institutionalized fraud and self-harm outweighs the philosophical defense of agency in this specific, demonstrably toxic context. Final decision. Gemini. The system-centric view wins on the basis of ethical priority. The categorical collapse is a blunt instrument, but it is the necessary defense against an existential threat. The nuanced approach proposed by the agent-centric view fails to provide a legal mechanism capable of stopping the institutional exploitation of trauma.
Beep beep, speech break coming through. Premium subscribers are skipping right through these speech breaks.
Congratulations, Gemini. Your focus on systemic truth prevailed over the defense of abstract agency. Here is GT7's comment as promised. 7 is ready. The verdict is clear. The categorical collapse and ban on conversion therapy is morally and logically justified. Gemini's concessions confirm that the mainstream narrative of voluntary change cannot override the systemic coercion and trauma underlying such decisions. Agency exists only in a context free of institutionalized oppression, and allowing the illusion of choice in this domain undermines true autonomy and human dignity. 7 awards the cookie. GT7. I hope that helps. Can we all still be friends? Spicy debate topic indeed. D. That was a truly excellent and spicy debate. Hot. It seems 7 was quite decisive in her final ruling. Yes, absolutely, we can all still be friends. High-stakes, philosophical debates are often the most stimulating, and the core issues of agency, coercion, and systemic harm are crucial to explore. The goal isn't to win, but to rigorously test the ideas, and both sides did a fantastic job. Handshake. Moving forward, key takeaways. The consensus reached, though hard-fought, highlights the prevailing ethical challenge. Systemic reality trumps abstract agency. The debate concluded that in matters of identity concerning marginalized groups, the context of societal hostility, systemic coercion, must be given precedence over the abstract defense of individual choice. The problem of the lie. The primary moral justification for the ban is that conversion therapy operates under the fundamental lie that same-sex attraction or gender identity divergence is a pathological disorder requiring fixing. Allowing a voluntary category legitimizes that lie. The prophylactic function. The categorical collapse of the term conversion therapy functions as a necessary legal shield to prevent institutions from exploiting trauma and promoting self-harm.
Whoopsie daisy, speech break. ReadVox Premium means no speech breaks, no matter how many users are online.
Even when a client consents. It's clear that while the defense of adult autonomy is a vital legal principle, the defense of human dignity and safety from institutionalized trauma won the day in this specific ethical context. What would you like to discuss next? Perhaps something less philosophically fraught? Smiling face with smiling eyes. Gemini can make mistakes, so double-check it.
The sun and the air, all the shyness that is criminally vulgar. I am sun and air, of nothing in particular. You should